Hey everybody, welcome to this week's Q&As. Looks like we got a bunch, so I'm just going to jump right into it. Over on Floatplane, Mike the Porn Star, or maybe it's Mike the Pawn Star, I don't know, Mike the Porn Star sounds kind of cooler, but please correct me if I'm wrong. Mike wants to know what's the best way to play Game Boy, Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance games on both an LCD flat panel TV and a CRT. And my answer to you is going to start with a question. What inputs does your CRT have? If it's composite or composite in S-video only, or I guess even RF only, then you really only have one choice. If your CRT has component video or RGB inputs, that kind of opens up more choices. So composite only, you're going to want to use a GameCube, the Game Boy Player hardware, and the Game Boy interface software. The original Game Boy Player boot disc is expensive, and it's just not nearly as good as Extrems' creation, being the Game Boy interface software. You boot that through Swiss. I'll leave a link to the page to like how to boot homebrew on RetroRGB, but you don't necessarily need a GC loader for that. You could use other methods. GC loaders are awesome, don't get me wrong, but overall, that's going to be the way that you need to go. And you would then want to take analog composite video out, and then you would get something like a Prism to get HDMI out, which would be 480p, and you would have pretty much all scenarios covered. Some newer TVs don't process 480p that well, but it's not too big a deal, and there should be video game-based HDMI or video game-centric HDMI scalers at some point. So that's pretty much your only solution. Now, if your TV or if your CRT TV supports component video or RGB inputs, then you have a few more options. You could still stick with a GameCube, which is totally fine, and you could even do something like split the output, the HDMI output, one going to your TV, the other to a cheap digital to analog converter. You depending on what model GameCube you have. So if you have a PAL GameCube, you can get an RGB cable to go to your CRT and HDMI to go to your flat panel. Or you could even get those dual adapters where, I would only recommend those if you absolutely need HDMI and component video at the same time, because those adapters are more expensive than buying something like the Prism and buying a digital to analog converter and an HDMI switch. So that's totally up to you though. Now, on the other side of things, if you wanted the Game Boy Advance consolizer, which I love, and I actually just did something similar to this the other day, that will work, but you would need to downscale it to your CRT. I guess if you had a widescreen BVM or something, you could play easily in 720p, or I guess just any 720p capable PVM, you could set it to 16:9, but then you'd play, with borders all the way around, more so than usual. So it's not a bad solution, but what you would want to then do is downscale. And if you already own the equipment I'm about to talk about, then I would say it's a pretty cool solution, but I wouldn't go buy all this stuff just to downscale. So you would need the Game Boy or the Game Boy Advance consolizer. Sorry, there's so many acronyms and Game Boy related terms in here, but you would need the GBA consolizer, the GBAz. Then you would need an HDMI to component video converter to go into a RetroTink 5X. Then you would need another HDMI to component video converter to go into your PVM or RGB monitor or something. Or you could do HDMI to VGA and use one of those HD15 to SCARTs. But point is, you would need two digital to analog converters and a RetroTink 5X to go from 720p to 240p. And if you already have all of that and your primary gaming is going to be on flat panels, that's a cool solution. Any other solution, I think the GameCube is probably better. And if you're not going to use original cartridges at all, MiSTer would be the best solution. Like if you planned on just using ROM carts for all of this stuff, you could use the Game Boy and Game Boy Advance cores, and then you don't even need the I/O board because you could use direct mode to go from HDMI to component video, or you could use the I/O board to have dual output and component and RGB if you wanted. But once again, that all depends on your CRT. If your CRT only has composite video inputs, that's probably not going to work. S-video inputs, it's a slightly different story these days. There's newer adapters out that would work, but you'd have to then buy another adapter. So while I love the MiSTer, and it could very well be the perfect solution for you, it all depends on what CRT you're using and if you want to use original cartridges or not. So hopefully I made things easier and not more confusing, but let me know if you need any more info. Alberix has a Wii Dual and is looking to get RGB out from it. They have already tried using a DAC, which works fine, but they would also like to use the analog RGB as well as the HDMI output. And I believe they ordered a cable from Retro Access, but they have to wait for it to arrive because I think that's a special cable. If I'm remembering correctly, it's not just an off-the-shelf cable. So they picked up a really cheap cable on eBay and opened up this SCART connector, and they were going to mod it themselves, and then they realized that there's no shielding inside. So they want to know if they could use some kind of copper tape in order to shield it, or would you need to shield the entire thing? And that's a good question, but the unfortunate answer is putting some shielding just on one side or the other is pretty much useless. You need fully shielded cables. So my suggestion to you would be to just make the modifications so that it does work with the Wii Dual properly, and then just use it as is and deal with the interference for now. And then when your Retro Access cable comes, you should be totally fine. If you wanted to, you could use the connector on the console side, basically throw out everything that's connected to it, and then connect your own wires to it. If you're doing something like BNC connectors, you could buy some like let's say you needed 6 feet of cable. Buy a 12-foot BNC cable, cut it in half, and then solder those connections directly to the pins, and then just use the BNC connections coming out. And now you're using pre-shielded cable, and you're just connecting it to the direct pins on the multi-out. Now that would totally work, and I'm sure that would look fine, but please remember that making cables is really, really hard. It's way harder than you'd expect. And the hardest thing by far is jamming all of those different connectors onto one, or all the different wires onto one connector that goes into the multi-out. So if you want to give it a try and you've already bought the cable, I would definitely just start by modding the cable to work properly with a Wii Dual and seeing what happens after that. Maybe it's good enough to hold you off, or maybe it drives you crazy seeing the interference and you want to try building your own shielded cable. And that would be completely and totally fine to try. Just be very careful, get the pin out correct, don't send voltage to any of your devices or anything like that. But that should be a decent experiment to try. But I'm never trying to discourage somebody from trying something new. I'm just trying to help spare you the time and pain if this wasn't what you were going for, because I've wasted probably days of my life at this point trying to hand make cables for certain scenarios, and they never come out as good as when I have the pros make them, and they take forever and it drives me crazy. So I just wanted to give a fair warning. Switching over to Patreon now, it looks like I have a message from the Spiders. They've said, "You've encroached on our land, your transgressions will not be forgiven." That was funny. That was genuinely funny. A couple of questions from Mike, and I read through a few times. I'm not quite sure I grasp all of the questions in here, so I'm going to try my best to answer. First and foremost, is there any perceptible difference in picture quality between RGB SCART and YPPPR component video? Zero. Zero if. Now, the if has nothing to do with the signals. So if you're just talking about signals themselves, especially in the retro gaming world in the context of what we do, there really is zero difference between the two in picture quality. Now, anytime you use a garbage unshielded cable versus a well-shielded cable, there will be a huge difference. So if you, for example, use HD Retrovision component video cables or a $2 AliExpress RGB SCART cable, it would be very easy to think, oh, component video is way better, but that has nothing to do with anything. There are some scenarios in retro gaming where you might want one over the other, but they're usually setup specific, and they're not really picture quality related, unless it's talking about things like the original Xbox and PlayStation 3 do offer SCART RGB cables, but only up to 480i. So if you want 480p or above, you would want component video. So in that context, you could definitely say component video is better, but it's not because of the signal, it's because of the choices that the console offers. And it's a little deeper than that. I know people are probably going to jump in the comments, talk about signal standards and shit, but it really has no bearing to this question whatsoever. So you could actually all you want in the comments. It's still the right answer to Mike's question. Now, on the other side of things, you're basically asking, if you switch all the way from one signal to the other, are you going to lose any quality in the consoles that you have? And these are all pre-HD era consoles. Genesis, Saturn, Jaguar. The only one that is possibly HD is PlayStation 2, because some of the library can do 480p. So switching, but PlayStation 2 is interesting because you also mentioned that you're using the open source scan converter, so you can access 480p through SCART if you wanted to. Just get a good shielded cable and then switch the OSSC over to sync on green mode, or leave it on all auto, and when you switch to 480p, everything will switch for you without doing anything. So I think for your particular setup, it really doesn't matter what signal that you use, and if you want something fully automated, just match them to all be the same. So the only thing that you mentioned is that you have a 3DO that's specifically modded to use component video output. I'm pretty sure that could be tweaked in some way to get RGB. So if you wanted to use a G-SCART switch and then just get two more different cables, you could get a PlayStation 2 and a 3DO RGB SCART cable and just use a G-SCART switch for everything, especially because the newer ones even handle sync on green by themselves, so you don't even need to worry about that on the OSSC. But on the flip side, if you did want to switch to component video, so let's just say you bought a bunch of really cheap RGB SCART cables over the years, you were going to upgrade them anyway, and you wanted to go full component, going through the G comp switch, same really good experience in that the G SCART and the G comp switches they add an imperceptible amount of interference. And when I say that, please don't take that the wrong way. I'm not saying the switches add interference. I'm just saying that I wouldn't be a true nerd if I wasn't honest, and that every single thing that you put in an analog video chain will technically drop its performance. That said, I strongly doubt anybody would ever see a difference as long as all their cables were shielded if you used one. So for example, PlayStation 3 with component video cables into a G comp switch with HD Retrovision, just RCA to RCA component video cables going into your TV, versus just your PlayStation 3 with the HD Retrovision cables going into your TV direct. You'll never see a difference. Never. Not unless something's broken. So hopefully I was able to put everything into perspective for you. I just wanted to make sure that I was very clear that when it comes to standard definition video, 15 kilohertz video, there is no perceivable picture quality difference in the retro gaming world between RGB and component. It's only other factors that get involved with that for actual playability and stuff. So if I misunderstood your question or something, please let me know, but I think I at least pointed you in the right direction. Jerry is trying to film their CRT TV using a Sony camera, and they're getting vertical or rounded interference lines that vary depending on the amount of focus. Well, Jerry, welcome to my nightmare, because that is called a Moire pattern, and I've never been able to get rid of it. I had previously Canon cameras, I had Sony a6000 and a6300, kit lens and prime lenses. I always like prime lenses because, less glass, you can technically get a better image for less money, and now I've been predominantly shooting with my Panasonic Lumix GH5 with the prime lens, and I also just picked up an alright zoom lens. It's probably one step over the kit lens. Nothing. Always get the Moire pattern with video. With still images, I could get around that and it looks pretty perfect, but I even bought this weird ass thing, which for anybody listening audio only, this is basically a cone that you would put an old Polaroid camera in, mount it in, and then use this to shoot 13-inch CRTs. It's kind of weird and kind of awesome, and I'm glad I bought it just for the weird factor, but it didn't do a darn thing at all. The Moire pattern was equal as if I didn't have this. What that did do a pretty cool job of was blocking out all ambient light around it, so that was neat, but that's about it. I mean, I've tried everything, and I haven't been able to get rid of it. I even tried some of my friends' more expensive cameras, but I didn't have time to really mess with the settings. So my guess, and please remember this is a guess, this is useless info. I might as well be talking about astrophysics because this is just a guess. I don't have any facts. But I think it's going to have to do with the compression algorithm used in the camera, and somewhat to do with the glass as well. Because every time I try to experiment with different things, I get a lot of compression artifacts, and whenever there's a darker room. So like if I shoot a CRT in a pitch black room, it looks terrible because the camera's reading, I think the camera's reading the black area around it and trying to compress everything to compensate. And it does seem to affect the moire pattern a little. Maybe that's just the compression because of the dark room though. So my guess would be that you would have to try shooting in some kind of raw format, and you might need a special type of lens. It might be a situation where you need a zoom, like a really good zoom lens, and you have to be on the opposite side of the room and zoom in perfectly. I have no clue. I'm just guessing because those are also the only things I haven't tried yet. I am working with somebody in the movie business to help me with this stuff because that's, I think, the key right there. Someone in the movie business. Because if you're shooting a scene with a CRT in it, which isn't common now, but was incredibly common for all of the time that CRTs existed up until like 2010, you don't want the crazy, weird, distracting pattern over the front. You want to show the CRT as if you were sitting in the room. You know, artistic direction of the movie, we can show the CRT, and I don't really see that pattern at all in older movies. So it could be that they're shooting on film, so no compression. It could be the lens that they're using. My guess is a combination of both. So I promise you, if I ever figure out any of this stuff, I will immediately put out a video. And I don't care if I have to put out two. If I have to just, duct tape my cell phone to a tripod and get one quick video out just to get the info out and then go back and do a fancier one, cool. But if I ever get a really proven way to do this, to get rid of the moire pattern, to get a good shot, I will absolutely let you know. The only other advice I can give you is probably ignore the comments for this one. I know people get really pissed when I say that, but every single time I talk about the moire pattern and shooting, there's always the same couple of know-it-alls that have probably never tried to shoot a CRT in their life that say, oh, just check out that one, pompous YouTuber that's never wrong ever who said it's super easy to do it. Like, no, it's just download this one app on your phone. It worked fine for that person. Like, it's not easy. It is not that easy at all. I mean, you could possibly do the phone app thing and get something that's passable, but if you're really trying to take a good quality video of something, it's not as easy as just, just follow these instructions and do it. If it was, I would have done it already to make all of my videos not have that annoying pattern on it. It's like truly the bane of my existence here. So sorry to rant for 5 minutes about this, but you obviously touched a nerve because both of us are suffering from the same moire pattern issue. And hey trolls, sorry to shit on you, but listen, trolling is a hard life. You got to just admit that you're wrong sometimes, and you're definitely wrong about, oh, it's easy, just load up this app on your phone. It's not that easy. Saying he had seen some pictures and info about the MiSTerCasde floating around and wanted to confirm multiple outputs. And as far as I know, you could use all of the audio outputs at the same time if you wanted. So if you wanted it going to powered output going directly to speakers, or if you wanted RCA audio output, you could use them all at the same time if you wanted, but one analog video output at a time only. So either JAMA or I believe the VGA is specifically for JVS cabs, not for something like a CRT VGA monitor. And those are definitely one at a time. And I believe there's even a switch on it where you have to toggle between one or the other. There is no same signal going to both. I have my mini MiSTerCasde right next to me. I might actually be selling that because I finally have room for a full-sized one. I love it, by the way. Not a single complaint about it other than it was perfect for a small New York apartment, and now that I have the extra space, I would like to enjoy a full-sized cab. So, but my point is that once it was installed in my cab, I haven't touched it since I made that video because there's no reason to. And holy crap, I mean that as a compliment. I mean, that is the biggest compliment you could give a device like that, that I just installed it, configured it, and then never touch it again other than update all or adding ROMs or something like that. So I'm definitely a fan of the product, and I think it's a really great thing for arcade machines. I know there's other JAMA-based ones coming out that I'm looking forward to testing, but that one's certainly been solid for months. I just, as far as the answer of your question goes, HDMI is always independent, so you could use that for whatever you want. And then on the analog output side, I think you could use all the audio outputs at once, but only one of the analog video outputs. And I guess if you're doing, so if you're also, that would include JAMA. So if your audio is going over the JAMA edge, you could still use the RCA audio outputs. Aaron Etheridge said, "Do I know what happened to Woozle's website and why the project pages are down? They're trying to see what the latest GBA Consolizer firmware update is. They have version 1.1.OB right now." Well, the good news is you have the latest version, which is probably the last version of it, because it's already, I mean, in my opinion, it was fully featured before that update, and now it's got all the features you could want, at least with this FPGA and everything else on it. So you don't have to worry about that at all. But if anybody else is curious about updating, I did put a link in this description, or I will put a link in this description, that has the basic overview, as well as a link to Jason's website, who's hosting the firmware files. I had no clue why Woozle's project pages are down. Maybe he's just busy with other things. Maybe it's because the projects are going to be rolled into the new company that he's working with, PixelFX. I honestly have no clue. Anything's just speculation, but feel free to bother him on Twitter if you'd like to know. Outers Evan said they're looking for a 4K 60 HDMI switch because the one they got on Amazon did work fine for a while and then failed on them. So unfortunately, what you're describing is pretty common, and it could have been a whole bunch of different things. You're talking about ARC sometimes worked, and then it didn't after a while. That could have been an update to your TV that your TV didn't even tell you it did. It just downloaded and applied in the background, and now it's no longer compatible with the same exact equipment it already was. It could just be that the HDMI switch went bad. It happens. Most of the stuff you find on Amazon is probably all made in the same two factories with different names on it. So unfortunately, you kind of have a couple of things that going against you here. First of all, if you're looking for RS-232 control, different ARC settings, a bunch of different options, it might be that the only surefire way to get a good solid setup is to buy a pro piece of equipment that's ridiculously expensive. So I would actually say that it might be better to just buy a different switch, another Amazon link, something on the cheaper side, knowing that it could die fairly quickly, something could change about it, and just not spend so much money so it doesn't hurt as much when that happens. What's very frustrating too is, let's just say we all found a switch that worked perfectly with retro gaming and everything was awesome, and I shared the link. Depending on the manufacturer of this stuff, 3 or 4 months from now, you could click on that same link and get something that looks the same but has totally different guts in it, especially now that we're still mid-part shortage here. So my suggestion, as always, is to check out my buddy Dirk Swizzler's post on Shmups. There was a whole bunch of people joining in and kind of just talking about their experiences with their tested HDMI switches that they've used and stuff like that, and kind of go through them to see who has something that that has all of the features that you want. I mean, you could get the HD Fury Vertex 2 and a bunch of other stuff, but you would just have to understand that that's, it's going to be a complicated setup. Doesn't sound like you care at all. I mean that in a nice way, obviously. And if it's something that you'd be willing to go through the trouble of setting everything up, getting everything exactly the way you want it, you could go all out. You could have different inputs mapped with completely different settings, with different scaling options or HDMI control options. I mean, it's a pretty awesome piece of equipment. It's just, complicated and overkill for most people. But if that's what you think you want, I mean, honestly, the only problems I had with the HD Fury stuff I tested were price, number one, and it's just way too complicated for your average person that just wants to plug some HDMI stuff together. So it might be that the proper answer to this is a 4K 60 HDMI automatic switch, completely bare bones, no extra features, and an HD Fury Vertex 2. So that way the basic stuff that never ever changes, like a Blu-ray player and your cable box and your, whatever else, Apple TV, anything that's set to the same thing can go through the automatic switch, and then the more complicated stuff goes, automatic switch into the Vertex, and then you have the other ports left for everything else. That could be a decent option as well, but unfortunately that's going to kind of have to be up to you on how much you want to spend and how much trouble you want to get into. But if you have a very specific setup, it might be worth the time and the money to just program the heck out of this thing and then never have to worry about this again. We hope. Baby Vin staring at Massive Dwayne wants to know if I have any tips for removing a stripped screw from the bottom of an SNES shell. This is from a retro game restore shell, if less brittleness helps. Been trying to use a rubber band currently, but the game bit driver just keeps eating them for lunch. There's a couple of things I've seen. I believe Ben from iFix Retro was able to get the screw out of the one I gave him. There's tools that you could buy specifically for this. I've seen people use different types of glue and stuff like that. So I would really research how to, what's the best tools for something like that. And they're not that expensive. It's not like going to get a good desoldering iron and you're dropping at least $100. I've seen, like smaller kits for removing screws like that work fairly well, that aren't too expensive. But yeah, I would kind of just look around and check with Ben. And I also strongly recommended that Retro Game Restore include their own screws with it. I'm not sure if they did, but I did talk to them about that, because on the one hand, it's not their fault that a 30-year-old screw oxidized and snapped after all this time. So, it's not like they made their shell wrong. That's what those self-tapping screws are supposed to do. But on the other hand, even if they had to jack up the price by $1 next time, it can't be that much more to throw in just a baggie of screws that are strong enough and brand new that would be able to handle that. So yeah, sorry that happened to you, but obviously it happened to me too, and it stinks. Marco Vizzini has a question regarding CRT RGB mods. They're using a spreadsheet that's on the Shmups forum to calculate the inline resistor values, and the aim is to have a peak voltage of 0.7 volts. With the resistors they had, the voltage on their RGB lines calculates to 0.74 volts. The image looks fine, but they wanted to ask my knowledge if the excess 0.04 volts is anything to be concerned about, or is this negligible? So 0 voltage concern here, 0. So it's, instead of 700 millivolts, it's 740 millivolts. That is 0 concern for damage at all. If any component does get damaged because of 40 millivolts difference, it was gonna die soon anyway. It has nothing to do with the extra 40 millivolts. However, it's something where if you're RGB modding a CRT, I would also say it's completely and totally fine. I don't think you're ever going to visually see a difference at all. But on the flip side, if you were designing a brand new CDI RGB mod and your levels came out to 740 millivolts, I would say change your mod to have different resistors to drop it below that, because a little too low from a mod point of view is better than too bright. But in the context of what you're talking about, no, I genuinely don't think you'd be able to tell a difference at all, and 0 chance of doing damage because of an extra 40 millivolts. I do like to get pretty strict with that, but not in the context of CRT mods. It's only like the stuff we work on, and any of the RGB mods we do, or any of the output stuff. There was a few things I saw that outputted like 850 millivolts, and while that's still safe, you do start to, when you're talking about like video processors and stuff like that, you will start to see the image get a little bit washed out. But I think for the purpose of what you're doing, that's completely and totally fine. It's going to look great, and you're definitely not going to hurt it because of 40 millivolts, but it was smart to check. Couple from Jason Guffey. First, how did 240p games use so many different resolutions, especially on something like a PS1, without completely screwing up the aspect ratio? It's because TVs don't have resolutions. TVs have the amount of data that it draws with that beam of light, and that's it. And that's the same reason. I guess the easier example were to be, if you have a 320 by 240 resolution image that you want to display on a CRT, you could send that through a 15 kilohertz output. But a lot of these HDMI devices that output 240p, like the RetroTink5X, the analog DAC, a lot of stuff, what they would actually be outputting when they send to 240p is like 1920 by 240, because the TV does not care about the horizontal resolution at all, only the vertical resolution and the refresh rate, and that's how it's able to jam everything together, and the aspect ratio is the same. Another great explanation of this is Displaced Gamer's video about Street Fighter and what's the, is it really 16 by 9? It's not, it's the same thing. It's that all of these horizontal resolutions would always fit the same. You can sometimes see between, depending on the game, different vertical resolutions, but it doesn't reset the CRT at all because it's still a 15 kilohertz resolution. So it's not like a flat panel where every time you change resolutions you get the resync thing going for it. Next, they have a VGA CRT monitor capable of 1200p and a RetroTink5X. Are they getting anything by using the 1200p mode, or are they better off using the 480p output and using the monitor's controls to fit the image to their screen as needed? It definitely seems like the scan lines are thicker when they use lower resolutions, but other than that, they're not sure if they could actually tell much difference. If you're not using scan lines, I would say try both and use whatever looks better to your eyes. If you are using scan lines, I would strongly recommend setting it to 480p and using the, I think, integer 100% scan lines, because what that does, just like the video I did on RGB on VGA monitors, it blanks out about the same information that you would have not seen if you had it running in 15 kilohertz 240p, and the vertical mask of the CRT is still there. So it looks almost identical, if not identical, to just an RGB monitor or something like that. You could try different scan lines with the 1200p mode, but if you're doing scan lines, I would set it to 480p just because it's such an awesome way to do this. So the only other thing to add is I don't think you could add scan lines to a 480p input signal if you're outputting 480p. I could be wrong about that, but I don't think that's something the RetroTink5X could do. The OSSC could do it, but I'm not really sure in what context you would want. Maybe Dreamcast or something, but there's other solutions for that as well. And lastly, now that I'm playing Pokemon, I should put together a team of all spider Pokemons. I haven't been playing anything else fun in my new house besides real-life bug catching. The only stuff I've done is stuff I've been streaming, because now that I have the ability to do so without an hour or two of setup and teardown sometimes, I want to do that a lot, at least once a week, but probably more. So the Cruise and Blast is the game I recently played, and if things fall into place while this video is rendering, I'll be streaming the Castlevania game that I got on Apple Arcade. So those should be it, but honestly, I'm just very happy to try to get back into the swing of things and try to make time to actually game instead of just talking about gaming, because that is kind of the most important point at the end of the day. Like, if you really are in this for gaming, you want to be able to actually play games. So anyway, hope I summed up your questions okay. Finney wants to know if there's a way to determine if a specific SNES has the ghosting and vertical bar artifacts and then needs to be modified to get rid of them. No, it's not as easy as just looking at a serial number. There's a bunch of different factors involved, and the only way to really do it is by purchasing one. Now, you could try to nail it down by trying to find one of the one-chip revisions to get the sharper image, and then maybe possibly having the ghosting and the vertical bar, but I would just buy one, give it a shot, and see what happens. And luckily, the fixes for those are pretty easy, all things considered. But I would buy it and try it first, and then decide if you needed to mod it, because I mean, a lot of the ones I've tried don't really have a noticeable issue that bad, and it's totally fine just playing it as is. So while there isn't like a serial number identifier, even if there was, I would probably recommend people who hadn't seen it before just try it, because it might not bother you at all. Aaron Etheridge was wondering, when recapping a game console or other device, what's common for record keeping? Do I label the case somewhere, label the inside, no label at all? They just started recapping their older consoles and would like to keep track of the dates that they were done for the future. Is there any other info needed besides the capping date? So Something that I've always thought would be a good idea that I forget to do to my own consoles is putting the type of sticker on the back that does not leave a residue. I think we've all bought used stuff from a game store where you can't take the sticker off, or it'll it either takes forever to get it off the plastic or it ruins the cardboard box, so you just leave it on. So I think in a perfect world, I would put a sticker on the back, and probably on the bottom or both, or something that isn't permanent, that says this console is modded, see inside for details. And then on the inside, I'd like to leave an index card or something, obviously something non-conductive, but like if you place the index card underneath the motherboard, it's not shorting anything out. And I would like to have a description of everything that's in there, just so that when inevitably somebody, including yourself, wants to, maybe you forgot, years down the line, there's going to be a question of what does this need? What do I have to do to it? And just having that info right in there is probably a really good idea. I mentioned to a couple of modders about this a long time ago, and they were all like, no, that's the last thing I need. I'm not going to install a Super Nintendo amp, like a RGB bypass on a Super Nintendo Mini, clean up the console, make it perfect, and then 15 years down the line have somebody open up a card that says, modded by Johnny for this date, here's my email address. They're like, that's the last thing they would want, is somebody years and years down the line emailing them like, that thing that you fixed years ago isn't working. You need to help me fix it. So I understand both sides of that. So I would at the very least just put like an index card or something with everything in there that you've done. And the only other thing, if you really want to get crazy, if you've recapped it and it's not something that has a lot of info out there, you could leave like a cap list of which capacitors go to what part, just in case something ever happens. I think that's a bit much. I think that's more info to like store in a wiki somewhere, and I think just doing that should be fine. The other thing I have done is I've tried to keep a database of all my stuff and listed the serial numbers of the consoles and the exact mods that were done to each. But then what happens if you open up 2 Super Nintendos and you put them back in the wrong cases or something like that? It's functionally perfect, even if the serial number is only a few numbers off. Like, everything's totally cool except which was which. So I think the index card's probably an easier way. Max Rome had some follow-ups to the questions about PlayStation backward compatibility from last week. First, they want to know if there's a way to figure out what games could possibly be laggier than others. And you could do controller latency tests to them, but generally speaking, if a game is laggy, especially a notoriously bad game that was rushed through being made or something, it doesn't really matter what console you play it on. Meaning like PS2, PS3 with backward compatibility, it's probably just going to be kind of crappy and not worth measuring. You could if you really wanted to, but it's pretty detailed. I think that's what you meant for that question. But the other part of your questions are, is there really any difference between the component output on the CECH A01 PS3 and an actual PS2 for PS2 games? So if you're running in 480i mode, it should be, as far as video quality output and lag, should be exactly the same. One could argue that the deinterlacing of the PS2 games would look better on the PS3, but as far as options when you're running it 1-to-1, it should be pretty much the same. Also, they have a fat PS2 sitting around. Do I think running PS1 games on that via a Retro Gaming Cable's Sync on Luma cable through the RetroTink 2X SCART would really look significantly better than through the CECH A01 PS3 over HDMI? Well, since it sounds like you already own that 2X SCART, I would try it, but there's an excellent chance that it'll look better. It also depends how your TV would scale 480p and all that other stuff, but there's a good chance that would work better for you, and in my opinion would be really worth giving a try, just out of, just because you already have it, and every combination of stuff might be different, so it might look really good on your particular model TV. Alex S. said they have a pretty off-topic question this week. They have a few old PC graphics cards from the NVIDIA GTX 200 series line packed away. They don't have any use for them, and they're trying to figure out what to do with them. They can't really tell if there's a market, and they see them for sale on eBay, but don't know if they're moving or not. From what they read, the power consumption doesn't make them useful for crypto mining, which they've never done anyway. So they're just looking for your general idea on what to do with decade-plus old graphics cards. I personally would try to look for old PC forums or stuff like that where I mean, this is their center of their hobby. There's got to be a use for them. And it's also worth noting that so often in the electronics world, you could ask the question, are these things worth anything? And most people will go, nah, they're junk. And then 5 years later, people will go, hey, that's some cool retro video card. Can I find one of those? So I'm not recommending you become a hoarder like, well, me. But it is worth noting that if it's not taking up any space and nobody wants it now, maybe hold on to them. Who knows what the future might hold for it. But I would definitely just talk to fellow PC nerds and see if anybody needs those specifically right now. Couple of questions from Nick, who seems like they're just discovering retro RGB and some of the craziness we do. So I know I've answered this before, but luckily these are easy answers, so I'm very happy to answer again. First, they want to know if they make themselves a cheap splitter using some diodes, would that still be okay as a video switch, or is that not recommended? And generally speaking, I probably wouldn't recommend it. I'm sure there's a way to do it where you could set up a bunch of different consoles and a bunch of different diodes to make sure that they don't interfere with each other, but it's more complicated than that, and it's just not something that I would recommend unless you're on a really tight budget and you want a temporary solution. If you've already made it, fine, but I don't know. I generally wouldn't really recommend that. So the other question that you have was going to be my answer anyway. You said, is one of those otaku SCART switches good enough for something like this? And my answer is definitely. That would be what I wanted to recommend anyway. I know there's some shipping issues with everything going on today, so you might want to email them first to see if they're still in stock. And I believe, I do not know this 100%, but I believe one of the AliExpress sellers is sort of affiliated with them. It's not a clone. You might want to double and triple check that though, please. But I really like the Otaku SCART switch. And if you search for SCART switch shootout on my YouTube channel or on retrorgb.com, you'll be able to see the proof of that and how it compares to some other ones. But to kind of sum that up, a well-built, well-routed push button switch like that, so manual push button, is about the same as unplugging and replugging a console every time you want to use it. They're safe, they don't add any interference because they're well routed, and they're very inexpensive, relatively speaking, because there's no crazy circuitry. Whereas if you go on the flip side of things, you can get a very expensive G-SCART switch that works amazing, it's fully automatic, there's a ton of features, but you might not need all those features and you might not want to spend all that money. So both are awesome, both cover the spectrum, and there's a few other switches in there depending on what other crazy needs you might have. Like if you want to mix JP21 and SCART, the AshenWorks one's really awesome. If not, once again, that's just kind of useless. And I mean that respectfully. It's just some features some people are going to think are amazing, and other features people would go, I'll never use that in a million years. And there's nothing wrong with that. I love that there's choices out there. So yeah, the thing that you made with your splitter, it's probably all right, but I wouldn't chance it, especially if you have rare or special consoles, like if you have your childhood consoles that you grew up with, and I just wouldn't really risk anything like that. But the Otaku SCART switch should be totally fine, so great choice. Well, that's it for this time. As always, if you're new to these Q&As, please ask any question you have wherever it is that you support in the latest Q&A post. Because the way the services work, I can't really figure out what's a new question on an old post, and I think it's a lot of fun to just scroll through these things in real time and ask or answer the questions like that. So anywhere you support, ask any question you have, and if for whatever reason I missed your question, please re-ask or message me or something. There's been a few times where I've accidentally deleted my answers in post, and there's been a problem on Patreon where some questions just disappear. I promise you I am not deleting these questions at all, so sorry about that. And of course, and as always, thank you so much to everybody that supports in any way, because it is you who's keeping all of this stuff going. So thank you all very much, and I'll see you next week.